Okay, so in today's video I want to talk again about applique, and this time I'm going to talk about using your zigzag stitch to give you a satin stitch finish like this here, which is a really neat finish. Takes quite a lot of cotton, but when you want that kind of a finish on something, really nice finish. Depending on what you're doing, there's a third way of doing applique on the machine as well, which I will show maybe in next week's video or a week after. Do a little project on that, which is a little bit more relaxed. So we've already done the blanket stitch, and now we're going to look at the satin stitch. It works particularly well, and I've used it here because I'm making the sewing machine mat, and I've got this fabric that's got these motifs on it, so I've been able to bond a web the back of the motif and then cut it out, and then I can satin stitch round it. So first things first, the foot that I've got on here, you will either get one of these with your machine, which is a satin stitch foot, it's normally called, which is a clear foot. Okay, so it normally gives you much better vision, and on the bottom of it there's a groove that runs down the center, so that means it will flow easily across the satin stitch, because the satin stitch, like a lot of the fancy stitches on your machine, is quite a lumpy stitch, if you like. So with your regular A foot you would probably find that it was struggling to move on as it goes along. So if we just quickly look at the zigzag stitch just as it is, and I'm leaving it on its regular setting here, which is the one that comes up when you come onto the machine. So the stitch width on this, the wobbly width, which is the swing of the needle, is 3, and the stitch length is 1.5. So I'm just going to stitch that out so that we can have a little look at that. Okay, so you can see that's quite neat, and that would do the job. Actually, what I would probably do is take it slightly wider so that I can guarantee I'm hitting, because as before you want to be hitting both sides, the fabric that you've bond webbed on and the outside fabric, so that you're finishing across like this. Okay, so I've taken that width up, but I've left the stitch length the same. So that's a fairly middle of the road zigzag. So now let's take the stitch length, because it's actually the stitch length on this zigzag that's going to make the difference. So I'm now going to take the stitch length down to about 0.8. And you can see already that's quite close. Now I'm stitching on felt here, which is reasonably thick, and what you will find is that the width of the stitch is going to depend as much on the fabric that you're using as anything else. If you're on a lighter weight fabric, then this would be a lot more spread out than it looks at the moment. So if I want to take it down even more, and the way to find out how to get a really tight satin stitch, which is what I showed you on the first thing, you can barely see any gaps between that stitching at all, is if you look, and I will move the camera, on your machine, if you go onto the buttonhole setting, then when you come onto the buttonhole, can you see it's already changed the stitch length down to 0.4? So that's telling me that my satin stitch on this particular machine, I would need it to be at 0.4, and that would be about the closest it can go. If you're on a machine with dials, if you take it to the buttonhole setting on your dial, it would do the same thing. Okay, that's going to give you about the closest zigzag you can get. Right, so I think we're now back. So I'm going to go back to my zigzag, and I'm going to take that now, sorry about all the beeping, down to 0.4, and you'll see the difference now. Can you see it's moving really slowly, and that is partly because it's so close now. I always say this, but if the machine is struggling to move the fabric on, then you need to take your stitch length up, okay, because it just means that it can't, it's struggling, it hasn't got enough thread to actually do it. And you do find this sometimes on a satin stitch, as I say, with certain fabrics, if they're a thicker fabric, because although this is thick, it's not mega thick. I mean, you could have thicker, but you can see the difference here in the stitch length as we've gone. And if I now show you the widest setting on the stitch width, so I'm going to take that up, and on this machine the widest setting is 7mm, which is the swing there. Your machine will either be 5mm, 7mm or 9mm. Okay. But you can see there's quite a big difference there in the width. Okay. So it's worth having a little play around with your machine and maybe actually writing underneath what setting it was on, what width, what stitch length you were doing, because a little sort of crib sheet like this, for example, in your sewing box will remind you when you're actually doing something with a satin stitch, some applique. It will remind you which setting you might want it on. You might think, actually, I'm going around a massive letter, so I don't know that I particularly want to spend hours and hours doing it. But because I'm on something quite small here, I'm going to use probably this setting here, okay, which was a sort of middle. This was the 3.5 for the width. So if we look at that, I'm using this foot here. Sorry, we did go through the satin stitch. This one here is called the, oh, hang on a second, the open toe craft foot, or sometimes an applique foot. An applique foot generally gives you a much bigger gap here, so you can really see what you're doing. I've left it on because it's going to make it a lot easier for you guys to see what I'm doing here. Okay, it's an extra. It doesn't usually come with a machine unless you're getting a machine that's coming with all the it normally comes in like a quilting kit. Okay, but I do quite like this for these sort of things, and as we go on I'll sort of move you along the bus, if you like, and we'll look more at zigzag stitch and what you can actually achieve with it for different effects on applique and decorative work. And this foot comes in really, really useful for when you're trying to do something a little bit more creative than at the moment we're just going to go around a square. So what I want to do, I'm going to do 2 little stitches. I'm just going to stitch it so that I can see that the swing of the needle is going to take me where I want to go. So that has shown me, and if I can get a pen in, that's shown me that we've gone outside of the fabric that I've Bondo webbed on, which is exactly what I want. Okay, I want it to go onto this fabric underneath. So I now know that that's doing the job, so I can then just happily stitch down, just keeping an eye. Now, because this is a rectangle, if it's a rectangle or a square, you want to stitch right down to the bottom. And like I say, it will take longer because it's a really intense stitch. So I'm down at the bottom. Now my needle is on the left hand side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take it over onto the right hand side. Needle is down. I'm going to lift the foot and pivot all the way round so that I get a really, really crisp corner there, because my next stitch is going to go over to the left and it's going to sort of box that corner in, if you like. So if I take it down and then I can show you. And this sort of thing is definitely worth practicing, because this is the kind of thing that will really, really up your game. Your finish on things just looks so much better, and it really helps your skill with the sewing machine. So again, I've taken it over now to the right hand side, because when I swivel round, the needle is now going to go over to the left because I'm on the other side. So this is the sort of thing that you'll kind of, as you practice, you'll realise quite quickly where you need to be, where the needle needs to finish. I'm going quite quickly, obviously, because I don't want you all to fall asleep while you're watching this happening. But if you do have speed control, and even if you don't, do try and do it a lot slower. Take your speed down, take your time, just do little bits at a time. And as you're coming up to the corner, especially if you don't have speed control and you're on foot pedal control, then at that point I would stop a couple of millimeters beforehand and then just start cranking my handle so I can do one stitch at a time, so I can be really accurate getting into that corner. So I'm just going to run it along here and finish it off so that I can show you the corners. When we did the blanket stitch, I said to you about going into curves. The same things apply with a satin stitch. As you're going into curves, you stop on the outside edge if it's an outside curve, and you stop on the inside edge if it's an inside curve. So it might be worth going back to that video. But as I say, I think this is the sort of thing that if you practice, and you can see that they're really neat corners on there, nice and squared off. Okay, this is the sort of thing, if you practice, just draw some shapes and then practice going around curves and corners and things like that, so that you can actually get your stopping, starting, and it's stop, lift and turn as you're going into curves and things. Okay, so just a quickie just to talk you through satin stitch, but like I say, we'll return to this and look at it a little bit in a bit more detail at a later date.